Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. May I please welcome you to this International Symposium on St. George. Please, can you settle down at the back? I would like to invite the Reverend Archpriest and convener of this symposium to say a prayer.
You rise, please. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Say together our Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Sede sapientiae, ora pro nobis.
Okay. Mr. Ma. Sorry? Can you please ensure that all mobile phones are switched off? And may we start this symposium. The theme chosen by the convener and a worthy group of people working within this basilica is about the mystery, or lack thereof, of the icon. We know that the purpose of art is beauty, and beauty is style. Style is a supremely difficult achievement, won by knowledge, calculation, and the scrupulous toil against the resistance of language. The icon's expressivity is looked on as a means of revelation of depth of feeling, not normally experienced. Its allure lies in the revelation and manifestation of mystery, rather than in its concealment, and it is almost capable of expressing an indefinite infini, the most private and the most satisfying. The icon is a text whose language is committed to process. While always pointing towards an aspect of immediate experience, this language, being inextricably connected with the past it commemorates, and constantly looking towards the future it celebrates, is in a constant state of flux. Or rather, I should say, it is motion in a state of stasis. For the effect of art is to arrest movement and to gently urge the reader's mind to intensify instead of going forward. The icon takes us beyond poetry, beyond art and beyond music, because it voices itself beyond text. Hence its ineffability, and we know that the language of ineffability is silence. As Keats tells us, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. The icon enables us to hear what T.S. Eliot calls the unheard music in the shrubbery, leading us to the rose garden. And as Virginia Woolf puts it, in the icon, music reaches a place not yet visited by sound. Therefore, having neither the aspiration nor the remotest ability to emulate Chaucer in addressing his pilgrims on their way to Canterbury, I shall now stop with my preambling and get down to the tale. May I, with pleasure and with honor, invite the first speaker to address the symposium, Reverend Dr. Joseph Farrugia, Archpriest of this Basilica and convener of this symposium. Joseph Farrugia was ordained priest in 1978. He studied at the Gozo Seminary, furthering his studies later as a postgraduate in dogmatic and fundamental theology at the Pontificia Università Gregoriana in Rome. He has various publications, including the latest, entitled Agiographia Georgiana in Maltese. He has been teaching at the Gozo Seminary from 1983 and at the University of Malta since 1988. He's, of course, the present Archpriest of our Basilica. May I please introduce Joseph Farrugia.
Thank you very much. To speak of St. George is to address mystery. To look upon and to contemplate his icon is to allow oneself to be addressed by mystery and possibly to be drawn to it. To venerate him is to have been drawn by it and to acknowledge that this mystery has already addressed itself to and somehow concerns one's being. St. George is a mystery of relationship. One may object here and wonder whether I am not stating too much and attributing too large a significance to a figure which indeed has at times been dismissed as of doubtful historical existence. Apart from the issue of existence, which to my mind is as spurious as it is persistent, the product of the questionable expertise of those Newman called pamphlet intellectuals, my reply is that the mystery which St. George embodies is neither simply his, nor is it dependent on him. In fact, it precedes him. It is larger than him. It transcends his being and outmeasures it. Actually, it constitutes the ground of his existence and possesses it. This mystery is the Christian mystery, and St. George has no significance and no real relevance outside its iconography. I believe that here a clarification of the term mystery, as it is being used in this context, might be useful. In common usage, mystery means something inexplicable and essentially beyond the grasp of the human intellect. Something before which one stands in awe or fear or perhaps indifference. In the language of Christian theology, though, mystery denotes something that cannot be met with indifference. The term may be used with reference to a person or to an event. Contemporary theologians often use it with reference to the person of Christ, who, as pre-existent being, was ab eterno hidden in the Father, but was revealed in the fullness of time. Christ is mystery, insofar as his humanity, the second person of the Trinity, insofar as in his humanity, the second person of the Trinity is revealed. This use of the term mystery is very much in line with its originally hidden, with its biblical employment as the event of saving grace. Salvation was likewise originally hidden in God, but became manifest and was offered to us in Christ. As you see, in the Christian vocabulary, mystery is always a revealed mystery. St. Paul speaks of Christ as the revealed mystery of God. The fathers of the church speak of baptism as the invisible reality of spiritual cleansing and divine adoption, made visible in a manner with which humankind can cope intellectually and existentially. Contemporary Catholic theology often makes use of the term with reference to the church. The church is also mystery, insofar as the visible church bears the invisible presence of Christ and of his grace, and also insofar as the church has been constituted the means whereby Christ may continue to carry out his saving activity in the world. As you see, in the Christian vocabulary, mystery is not meant primarily to affirm concealment, but rather the opposite. It is meant to affirm the actual disclosure of the hidden God and the real access that we now have been given to his holiness. In scholastic terms, Christian mystery is remote holiness rendered within reach. It is invisible grace made visible. Indeed, the author of invisible grace made visible. It is God himself becoming manifest in the humble humanity of the incarnate Word, so that John could say, "We have seen the Word of life, we have heard him, we have touched him." It is for this reason that, to further clarify the term, St. Paul speaks of Christ not only as mysterion, but also as eikon. Christ is the icon of God, that on the one hand speaks of God's sacrificial love for mankind, and also at the same time offers itself as language that enables humankind to respond to God in similar love. Those who actually do make this response become in turn themselves icons of Christ, bearers of his sacrificial image, and empowered with his same saving grace. The early church held in the highest esteem those who became such icons of Christ, to the extent that they suffered, shed their blood, and died in union with him. It reserved for them an astounding cult and honored them with the exclusive title of martyrs. To speak of St. George is to speak of this kind of icon, peculiar to the Christian mystery. St. George is not, of course, the only such icon, and there are many others bearing other names. But of the 6,538 names of saints carried in the latest edition of the Roman Martyrology, all of whom denote the mystery of Christ, his icon seems to have become the most readable of all, earning perhaps the highest number of hits as the most popular icon of the mystery that St. George serves. In this paper, which I am presenting with the object of introducing the subject matter of this symposium, I propose to make three very brief considerations on St. George, or rather on the icon that St. George is. I shall consider very briefly its status as a received memory, its function as a perceived presence, and its essence as a mystery of relationship. St. George as received memory. The memory of the martyrs, cherished by the local churches from the 2nd century onwards, has its origins in the natural pride of those Christian communities who could boast of a list of martyrs and who felt illustrated by their glorious death. Every local church throughout the Middle East and the Mediterranean took great care to record in its annals the dates of those who had suffered and died in odium fidei. Every local church jotted down not only the names of its members who had died for the faith, but also of those Christians who originally belonged to other communities, but had shed their blood and were buried in its locality. Their tombs secured their blessed memory. With the beginning of the Constantinian era, these tombs began to be adorned with all kinds of works of art, and the more important ones were further honored with the building of churches above them. Thus, their memory became even more illustrious. As a result, the Christians who kept their tombs felt not only illustrated by the memory of their martyrs, but also similarly illustrious. Every local church desired to possess the relics of the martyrs, and this gave rise to a wave of relic hunting and relic mongering that lasted for many centuries. The relics were memory received and the evidence of its friendly presence. Of course, there could be no memory of the martyrs denuded of their imagery. So the icons of the martyrs, that is, their respective imagery, began to take shape, first through the spoken word, and then by the written account, and eventually by the painted image. Many elements contributed to the formation of these icons. These included the actual tomb of the martyr and its locality, the acta and the passiones, that is, the account of the martyr's deeds and sufferings, the culture of those who listened to them and then transmitted them to others, the martyr's relics and the miraculous power ascribed to them, the composition of the martyr's idealized life story, as well as the number and the size of the churches dedicated in his or in her honor. Each and every one of these elements bore the memory of the martyr, communicated it, celebrated it, guaranteed its continuation, and gave added impetus to its growth. The more illustrious the martyr appeared to be, the greater the illustriousness of the church that identified itself with him. These are the same elements that contributed to the formation of the icon of St. George, which, notwithstanding the conciseness and sobriety of its authorized written form, is certainly quite graphic and ornamental in any other form. The authorized written form of the icon of St. George, as it has been received in the Roman Catholic Church, is that which appears in the Missale Romanum, in the Liturgia Orarum Juxtaritum Romanum, and in the Martyrologium Romanum. I have given a handout, and these handouts carry the texts that appear in these three authorized Catholic publications. The Roman Martyrology, as revised and published in 2001-2002, carries just about 3 lines on St. George, which is actually standard fare as regards the martyrs of the early church. Topping the list of saints whose commemoration falls on April 23rd, the insert reads as follows: Dies natalis Sancti Georgi Martyris, cuius gloriosum certamen Diospolis eulida in Palestina, omnis ecclesiae ab oriente ad occidentem ab antiquitate celebrant. Likewise, the note printed in the Officium Divinum for the same day is brief. But this is slightly different, due to the nature of the note's function. Seculo IV, iam veneratione affectus est, Diospoli in Palestina, ubi et ecclesia in eius honorem extructa erat, eius cultus per orientem et occidentem iam ab antiquitate diffusus est. These sober memorials are quite in conformity with the dispositions of the 6th century Decretum Gelasianum, which sought to curtail certain accounts of the Passiones and Dacta of St. George, which were deemed false and heretic. The Decretum Gelasianum states that St. George is one of those saints whose names are justly reverenced by Christians, but whose actions are really only known to God. As I said, the 2 statements that I have just quoted from the Roman Martyrology and from the Roman Divine Office manifest the basic elements of the authorized version of the icon of St. George. It is an icon that is composed of 3 basic dimensions: the historical, the hagiographic, and the liturgical. The historical dimension is confined to the statement that the veneration of St. George started very early, ab antiquitate, according to the Martyrology, Seculo IV, in the 4th century, according to the office. It started at Diospolis, or Lydda, today's Lord, in Palestine, according to both, where a church was dedicated in his honor. The second dimension, the hagiographic, is extremely restricted indeed. It is confined to the statement about his martyrdom, the glorious struggle, according to the Martyrology. The glorious martyrdom that St. George went through in defense of the faith. The third, which is the liturgical dimension, emerges in the very celebration of his Dies Natalis, as well as and especially in the text of the day's collect, as it is found in the Roman Missal. In this collect, in this prayer, apparently derived from the 8th century Sacramentarium Gelasianum, the Catholic Church simply affirms the unity of the suffering or passion of St. George with the passion of the Lord, and sees in his glorious martyrdom a manifestation of the power of God. Of course, there is more to the received memory of St. George than the essential elements of history, hagiography, and liturgy that compose Rome's authorized icon of the martyr. The hagiographic text selected by Rome for St. George's Day as second lesson of the Officium Lectionis could be considered an initial admission of the much more adorned icon of the saint that is peculiar to popular piety, and that should be offered for the contemplation of Catholics. This text, lifted from one of the sermons of St. Peter Damian, abounds in imagery. The imagery of St. George's glory rooted in the triumph of the risen Christ. The imagery of St. George's military profession, which the martyr put at the service of Christ. The imagery of St. George's struggle against evil and his victory over it. The imagery of St. George's acceptance of the cross of Christian witness in harsh suffering. And the imagery of St. George as an exemplar, a model for the Christians. Of particular significance is the affirmation of the importance of imagery in the commemoration of St. George. The Christians are invited to look upon him. This is what the St. Peter Damian is calling upon the Christians who are listening to him to do. They are invited to call upon him with admiration, though not only to marvel at him, but especially to imitate him. These are the same features that form the icon of the saint venerated by Orthodox Christians. The hymns and prayers of the Orthodox Anthologion that compose the liturgy of, to quote, the glorious and, the holy and glorious great martyr, George the Triumphant, again present a much more elaborately composed icon of the saint than that which obtains in the official hagiography of Catholicism. The Orthodox texts reflect the rich imagery that is repeated in the portable and other St. George icons of Christian Orthodoxy. These icons carry the imagery of epic suffering, idealized Christian virtue, uncompromising struggle with the dragon of heresy and moral evil, heavenly glory, as well as the imagery of powerful intercession in favor of the Church as such or of individual devotees. Mainstream Western paintings and sculptures depicting the martyr manifest the persistence of this same imagery. The status of St. George as received memory is also that of a transmitted presence. For this reason, the memory of St. George cannot be simply that of an immutable biography, fictitious or otherwise, of a distant saint. Rather, it is that of a dynamic image which illustrates a living and glorified being. The icon does not transmit the dead martyr, but the living saint. The primary interest of the icon is not to represent past history. It is rather to render visible the presence of the saint in the actuality of his glorious existence. It is a received presence. It states the presence of God and makes it visible in his saints. It focuses God's presence in the holiness of his saint. But it also states the presence of the Church before God. The icon, that is the saint represented by its imagery, serves humanity by rendering it present before God in an act of praise, thanksgiving, and petition. As you see, the icon, apart from being a received memory, is also a perceived presence, a living presence, indeed a very special presence. It is indeed mystery, insofar as the icon discloses the invisible grace of God working in the earthly life and manifest in the heavenly existence of his chosen ones. I come now to the second reflection, St. George as a perceived presence. The commemoration of the Dies Natalis on the anniversary of a martyr's death took the form of a joyous celebration. It was therefore an entirely different thing from the commemoration of the ordinary dead. The martyrs had nothing ordinary about them. Indeed, as Peter Brown describes them, they were very special dead. Their special memory called for a special commemoration that included reading from the accounts of their deeds, singing their praise and the glory of their names, petitioning them for their powerful intercession, and giving thanks to God for their mysterious presence through the partaking of the Eucharist. The special commemoration accorded to the martyrs on the site of their tombs had its justification in the perception that the Christians had of their living and powerful presence in their midst. Christus in martyre est, wrote Tertullian, around the turn of the 3rd century. This statement expressed the real meaning that the martyrs' relics had for the early Christians. Christ was perceived as being really present in the martyr, and this was so not only during the course of his or her sufferings, but also and more so in their death. Moreover, after the martyr's death, his presence continued to abide with his or her remains. The martyr's tomb localized the special presence of the risen Lord, and of course, the relics symbolized also the martyr's own living presence in the Lord. The imagery arising from these relics is never that of the memento mori. Rather, it is that of the suppression of the fact of death. It is that of the living saint. It is that of his deified presence. It is this kind of living and deified presence that Theodosius, an early 6th century pilgrim to Jerusalem, perceived when he visited the tomb of St. George in Diospolis, Palestine. Theodosius had traveled from North Africa to the Holy Land, and he left an account of his pilgrimage edited as the Situ Terrae Sanctae. Quoting in translation, he described his visit to the tomb of St. George as follows. He says, "It is 12 miles from Emmaus to Diospolis, where St. George was martyred, where his body lies, and where many miracles occur." This text is all about the imagery of life and power, holiness and prayer, and of course, history. The component of this text is basic source material for the icon of the saint and for the presence therein perceived and transmitted. The actual presence of St. George as perceptible in his icon manifests at least 5 basic dimensions: the theological, historical, hagiographic, votive, and liturgical. The presence perceived in the icon of St. George is primarily a theological one. The icon speaks, of course, about God. God is, after all, the co-author of the icon. God is the source of the holiness that infuses the saint, as well as of the power behind the miracles worked through his intercession. But the icon speaks also of the communion of martyrs, as described by John, the communion of those who have come out of the great tribulation and washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. As white, of course, as the brightness that transformed Christ on the Tabor, when, as we read in Matthew, his face shone like the sun and his garments became white as light. These are those Christians whom God took as his own by separating them from the world, from the profanum, and by infusing them with his divine energy. The icon of St. George is the revealed mystery of this energy. That is, it speaks of the glorified state of the historical person, whose history, moreover, cannot be ignored. Thus, the icon raises also the historical dimension. It is obvious and logical to suppose that within the image of the deified person, there is hidden that of the person previously merged in human history. But this is not to say that true and reliable information about the history of that person is necessarily available. Pope Gregory the Great was already complaining in the 6th century that the only information about many martyrs venerated by the Church in Rome was confined to the name, the place, and the date of their martyrdom. It is legitimate to suppose that St. George was one of the martyrs that the Pope was then referring to, which of course does not entitle anyone to say that St. George never existed, as Gibbon pompously implied when he mixed up George of Lydda with the alleged corrupt Egyptian bishop who bore the same name and who was lynched by the angry populace of Alexandria. A lack of biography does not mean a lack of existence, but it does diminish the chances for the growth of the martyr's cult. St. Gregory of Tours pointed out in his Gloria Confessorum that the saints needed some kind of life story for their veneration to grow and strengthen. It is most probably in this context that the hagiographic icon of St. George emerged. The hagiographic dimension is perhaps the only weak aspect and at the same time the most controversial one of the icon of St. George. It is the dimension that has imperiled the scholarly acknowledgement of his historicity, although to my mind it shouldn't be so. When the life story of St. George is read in the light of the canons of classical hagiography, I would say even in the light of biblical hero biography, such as that of Joshua and David, it should cause no problem of interpretation. Whether it is inscribed on parchment or printed on paper, or whether it is written in the imagery of consecrated wood, the life story of St. George is always to be read as a concentratio epica, that is, as the story of one person to whom various marvels originally associated with others are attributed, and in whom various acts worthy of praise, performed by persons of minor significance, are concentrated. The Greek inscription discovered by Burckhardt at the town of Shaka in Syria may be indicative of this epical concentration that the hagiography of St. George is all about. The inscription tells of a mid-4th century church dedicated to the holy and triumphant martyrs George and the saints who suffered martyrdom with him. The hagiography of St. George is therefore none other than the typical illustration of a martyr saint whose name was George, whose body was buried in Lydda, whose tomb had become a center of pilgrimage, but whose name became locus of convergence for the best and the loftiest in the acta and passiones of other martyrs less fortunate than him. Apart from the hagiographical details attributed to him from the late 5th century onwards, little can be said about George, other than that he is a martyr whose name is justly revered, but whose actions are really only known to God. Another dimension of the icon of St. George is that which I have just mentioned, the reverence that it is rendered, or if one prefers, its votive aspect. The icon, and here I refer to it in its restricted meaning as a painted icon, is essentially a means of contact with the saint whose symbolic image assures the Christian in prayer before it of the saint's real presence in the church and for the church. The presence perceived in the icon stimulates trust and surrender before God. The votive dimension includes both the liturgical relevance of the icon in Christian worship as well as its devotional function in the ordinary life of Christians. In both its liturgical and devotional aspects, the votive icon portrays the saint as intercessor. This is perhaps the most common and popularly significant form of the icon of St. George. Finally, and in particular with reference to St. George, one cannot ignore the ecumenical dimension of his icon. St. George is a saint who hails from the East, but whose cult, while remaining firmly embedded amongst the Eastern Christians, spread far and wide throughout the churches of the West. In the meantime, the schism between Rome and Constantinople occurred, and the enmity between the two branches of Christianity deepened. Nevertheless, St. George was rejected by neither side, but rather his cult continued to grow in both churches and became almost a point of unity, a common ground. The opposite, however, happened in the 16th century with the rise of Protestantism. In this case, St. George was not only rejected by the latter, but became an exemplar of the deep division between the Catholic and the Protestant branches of Western Christianity. Obviously, in this case, rather than of ecumenism, one has to speak of inter-Christian strife. Up to the 16th century, it was commonplace in the West and accepted throughout the Church to venerate the saints and implore their intercession. As Oxford scholar John Kelly writes, the cult of the saints started with the preservation of the relics of martyrs, the heroes of faith, whom Christians held to be already in God's presence and glorious in his sight. In no time, this hero veneration began to include prayers for their assistance on the ground that if martyrs prayed for their fellow Christians while they were still alive, it was natural to believe that they would do so all the more now that they were crowned with heavenly glory. The saints were not only exemplars of the true faith, they were also intercessors for their fellow Christians. But this was exactly what Reformation theologians sought to deny 1,000 years later. The Protestant Reformation, which had started as a legitimate protest against abuse in the Church, evolved, at least so it appeared in the eyes of the Catholic Church, into a catalyst of heresy and schism, with the Reformers ending up rejecting everything and anything that was linked to the Roman hierarchy. The cult of the saints featured prominently here. Devotion to the saints underpinned the Catholic Church's teaching on merit, tied to good works. The Lutheran reformers rejected the concept of merit for good works, the mediating function of the Church, and therefore they rejected the power of intercession that the Virgin Mary and the saints were believed to possess. The followers of John Calvin, another Reformation leader, went even further than those of Luther in their opposition to the Catholic Church's traditional veneration of saints. They resented the Catholic Church's hold over the faithful. In their eagerness to demolish this hold, the Protestant reformers simply had to wreak as much damage as possible on whatever and whoever sustained the Catholic hierarchy. And so they set out to destroy the images of the saints, scattering their relics and desecrating their tombs. St. George was one of their victims. Indeed, St. George came up for some very harsh Protestant criticism. No wonder, since St. George was the saint whose popularity had grown beyond any measure during the Middle Ages, and rightly or wrongly was seen to embody the doctrines that the reformers rejected. Wallis Budge writes, "The fact that St. George was held in the highest esteem in many countries in Europe made him most obnoxious to Martin Luther, Tilenus, Melanchthon, and their followers. Calvin called him a larva. Chemnitz said he was an unnatural being, and other theologians of the period said he was a nobody, a nonsense, a fictitious person, an idol, an allegory, or a symbol." In their eagerness to undermine the Catholic Church, the authors of the Reformation could not ignore St. George. They had to demolish him as well. Of course, they were bound to fail, and rather than destroying the mystery of St. George, they ended up embracing it by turning St. George into a symbol of the triumph of their new faith over the old faith of the Roman Catholics. In some Protestant caricatures, St. George is presented bearing the symbolism of the Protestant churches, and the dragon bearing the symbolism of the Catholic Church. As usual happens with me, taf ġifiri l-aħħar minuta. All right, I will conclude. Okay, here then. Bearing the symbolism of the Church of Rome in her Babylonian captivity. I beg your pardon.
We're used to it. We're used to it.
Everybody's used to it. As a sign of contradiction like no others, I'm concluding. St. George survived this trial, and today his name is much more correctly evoked by many Christians belonging to the Reformation tradition. Today, Protestants and Catholics alike look upon St. George and see in him the most eloquent symbol of the triumph of good over evil, with the added role of powerful intercessor for the Catholics and their Orthodox brethren. Concluding, a very brief reflection on the third aspect of the icon of St. George as a mystery of relationship. The icon of St. George is an icon that expresses relationship, a relationship to which St. George contributes by offering himself as accessible mystery, and to which the Church in the world contributes as well by accepting George's offer of himself as revealed mystery. The vocabulary that describes this relationship is very rich indeed, and it includes such words as memory, veneration, intercession, paradigm, exemplariness, patronage, friendship, and communion. It is the vocabulary that belongs to traditional Catholic and Orthodox theology, with some of it becoming increasingly, though tentatively, adopted by some Protestant theologians as well. I shall not pause further on this aspect of the mystery of St. George, since it is the area that will be mostly addressed by colleagues in this symposium. Concluding this paper, I would like to say that St. George is an icon that can and should be addressed in the sober environment of scholarship. But let me point out that insofar as it belongs to living Christian mystery, its real significance won't be grasped other than in its appropriate environment of liturgical commemoration, devoted contemplation, and festive thanksgiving. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father Joe, for that very interesting paper on St. George. May we now go on to this, our second speaker, Dr. Bronwyn Neil from the Australian Catholic University. Dr. Neil obtained her Master of Arts in Theological Research at the University of Durham in England and her PhD from the Australian Catholic University. Her area of specialization is the Latin translation of the life of Maximus the Confessor. She holds a postdoctoral fellowship to edit the Latin life of Pope Martin I. This visit is her third to Gozo, and recently she delivered a paper on Saints Cyril and Methodius at the University College of London for the past and present history, the Anglo-American Historical Society. She will also be delivering a lecture at the International Patristics Conference in Oxford in August. Apart from many articles, she has published 2 books as co-author on the life of Maximus, the Confessor, in the Corpus Christianorum Series Graeca and the Oxford University Press. She will be talking to us on the patristic origins of the cult of St. George. Brownwood, thank you.
Thank you, Maria. It's a great pleasure to address you today. We'll just wait until the overhead projector is set up, I think. Okay. Thank you. My task today is a deceptively simple one: to establish the evidence for the cult of St. George, patron saint of England, Portugal, Georgia, Gozo, amongst others, in the patristic period up until the 8th century. Other papers presented at this symposium will concentrate on the visual evidence for the cult of St. George. I will focus rather on the written tradition, the earliest accounts of George's life and death as a martyr circa 303. That is around the time of the great persecution of the Emperor Diocletian. We will also consider the archaeological evidence for the cult, which originated in the east but quickly spread to the west, making George the trophy bearer, Tropeophoros, the bringer of victory, Nikeophoros, and the great martyr, Megalomatis, the brightest star in the firmament of saints of antiquity. George belongs to the category of soldier saints, like Demetrius of Thessaloniki, Theodore of Euchaeta, Mercury, and Procopius. The early establishment of the cult of St. George is evidenced by discoveries of churches dedicated to him in Syria, Palestine, Byzantium, Egypt, and Asia Minor. The centre of his cult and the site of the earliest known church of St. George from circa 530 was Lydda in Palestine, where his tomb was displayed. Thank you. All right. Good. There is probably no historical basis for any of the events recorded in the earliest Greek legends of George, which come from the late 4th century, as Krumbacher has established. Krumbacher also emphasised the late origin of St. George's miracles, which appear in the Greek tradition not earlier than the 11th century and probably stem from the 10th. Even his birthplace is undeterminable, being identified as Cappadocia in Asia Minor in some versions, or the town of Melitene on the upper Euphrates in others. Gibbon's theory that the saint could be identified with George, the semi-Arian bishop of Alexandria, who was slain in 361, has been convincingly refuted. The legend of George slaying the dragon did not appear until the 11th century in the East, and in the West not until the 12th, culminating in its appearance in the golden legend of Jacob of Voragine in the 13th century. As we all know, according to this version, George was a military tribune from Cappadocia, who found the population of Cylena in Libya terrorised by a plague-bearing dragon, which lived near the town. To spare the king's daughter, who was to be sacrificed to feed the dragon, George courageously speared the beast with his lance, then summoned the maiden to throw her girdle around the beast's neck. The dragon, miraculously tamed, rose and followed her, tame as a dog on a leash. George promised the terrified inhabitants that if they were baptized as Christians, he would slay the dragon. Naturally, they agreed, and the dragon was duly dispatched. The fact that there is no historical evidence for this legend in no way detracts from the historical origins and value of the cult of St. George. As Hippolyte de la Haye remarked in his famous work Les légendes hagiographiques, and I quote, "It is a serious mistake and a very common one to think that when a saint's story is declared to be legendary, all is lost, that discovery brings the saint himself into disrepute. Christian saints are not like Turnus or Dido. Saints have a real existence outside written documents. Their memory is perpetuated and lives on in the very life of the Church." So, to part 2. What are the earliest surviving texts bearing witness to the cult of St. George? The earliest text that survives is the Greek palimpsest fragment in a Viennese codex dating to the 5th century. This fragment of the official literature associated with the cult appears to have been sponsored by senior clergy connected with the two places that figure in George's story, Cappadocia and Palestine. These clerical figures were namely Theodotus, 5th century Bishop of Ankara in Cappadocia, and Theodosius, Bishop of Jerusalem. This represents one branch of the miracle stories about George. The other is represented by the standard texts in Greek manuscripts Vaticanus Graecus 1660 and Parazinus Graecus 499 from the 11th and 10th centuries. A 6th century papyrus from the Negev desert discovered at Nassana is our next most ancient source for the martyrdom of St. George. Another 6th century Syriac version of the martyrdom of George has been found in monastic collections of the Wadi Natrun. The early Greek and Syriac versions were later translated into Latin, Armenian, Coptic, and Old Nubian or Ethiopic. The Coptic version is much less rough in style than the Greek or the Latin, indicating that the redactor improved on his original, which was probably a Greek text now lost. An Armenian version of the Passion has been preserved in two 13th century manuscripts and is more closely related to the Greek palimpsest of Vienna and to two early Latin translations. St. George's Acta were dismissed as apocryphal in the 6th century Decretum Gelasianum, which lists the Passion of George among those books which are to be rejected, along with the Passions of Syricus and Julita. What do the earliest sources convey of the legends associated with St. George? All the texts hand down the single tradition of George the Unkillable. His protracted fate is foreshadowed in God's promise that he would be tortured for a period of 7 years before his ultimate death. 3 times he was tortured in diverse horrible ways by the king for refusing to offer sacrifices to the pagan gods. He was stretched on a wheel studded with nails. He had nails driven into his head. He was exposed to vultures, dipped in a vat of boiling lead, crushed by a huge boulder, and boiled in a cauldron. 3 times he died, and 3 times the Lord appeared to him and raised him up. During this process, he performed various miracles. He withstood the deadly poison of the king's magician. He made the wooden thrones of the 70 kings put forth leaves and fruit. He healed a widow's 9-year-old son, first of his blindness, and then of his lameness and deafness as well. And most extraordinarily, he raised to life 19 people who had been dead for 200 years. He proceeded to baptize them and then made them vanish into thin air. Most striking, perhaps, is George's exchange with the demon which inhabited the statue of Apollo in the temple. The demon identified himself as one of the angels who, at the time of the creation of the world, refused to offer homage to humankind, God's new creation. For this he was banished to the underworld by God, but he roams the earth, snatching up those who have been turned away by the church. These miraculous events are related in a tone that is so unembellished as to sound factual. The early version of the Passion of George uses simple language to convey vividly the suffering of martyrdom. We should remember that at the time of writing, the horrors of persecution were still reasonably fresh in the minds of the Christian audience. This applies both to Roman government persecutions within the empire until 313 and to widespread persecution of Christians in Persia, beginning with the rule of the Sassanid king Sapor II between 340 and 372. Syrian Christians were no strangers to persecution in the 7th century, with the Persian expansion that was only halted by the Emperor Heraclius. A noteworthy miracle from the Coptic, Arabic, and Ethiopic miracula concerns Diocletian, who sends an official to George's shrine in Lydda. When he breaks a glass lamp before St. George's icon, a piece of glass sticks in his head. He develops leprosy and dies. Then Diocletian himself goes to Lydda, where the Archangel Michael intervenes. Diocletian goes blind and dies shortly afterwards. This account, not found in the Greek miracula, corresponds to representations which we find in early Georgian art of St. George spearing a man who is sometimes identified with Diocletian. And we see this in a 16th century silver rood from Georgia, which has 8 panels devoted to the miracles of St. George. I'll just put it on. In the first panel, the top left, we see George spearing a man who's identified as Diocletian in the Georgian inscription. It is very interesting to note how many references are made to dragons in the early versions of the legend. In the Armenian Passion of George, he is crucified for 7 years by the autocrat Dacian or Dadian, the text varies, before a tribunal of 70 kings. In the Latin translation of this Armenian text, Dacian is described as Draco Illicaladus, that red-hot dragon, and as Draco Isti Abyssi, that dragon of the deep. In George's plea to Christ for aid in his trials, he cried, Dracone sibulum compescuisti, qui angelos seditiosos in profundo tatri conclusisti, ubi intra repagula portarum inferni draconibus cruciantur. You silenced the dragon's hissing, you who confine the treacherous angels in the depths of Tartarus, where they are tormented by dragons within the bars of the gates of hell. We might conclude that the dragon slayer of the medieval legend is prefigured in this early account, where the emperor who worships pagan gods, whether the Roman Diocletian or the Persian Dacian, represents the forces of evil which have to be defeated. This interpretation of the later story is confirmed, I think, by this silver rood from Georgia with the 8 panels. In the first, as we have seen, George is shown spearing Diocletian. On the right, he spears the dragon, accompanied by the boy seated behind him on a horse. We'll return to him later. In the opposite corner, the princess leads the dragon off by her girdle tied around his neck. In the fourth image, George slays the dragon with a sword. So, on to the archaeological evidence for the cult of George in the East. Literary evidence for the early date of George's cult is corroborated by archaeological discoveries. The original shrine at his tomb in Lydda may have been established as soon as the 4th century, which corresponds to the possible dating of George's death to circa 303. Perhaps the earliest inscription relating to George, found at Shaka in Haran, which has been dated variously to 323, the mid-4th, or as late as the 6th century, marks the dedication of a church to George and fellow martyrs, and Father Joe has already referred to this inscription. The Greek reads as follows: The house of the holy and triumphant martyrs, George and the saints who were with him. Bishop Tiberinus built the nave and portico of the church from their foundations as an offering in the 15th indiction 263, with the support of the deacons George and the great Sergius. You'll also find this inscription in the marvellous exhibition which was opened last night here at St. George. 5th and 6th century churches and monasteries dedicated to George have been found in Syria, Palestine and Constantinople. The cult seems to have become established in Egypt by the 6th century, with the first church dedicated to George in Cairo appearing in 684. There is evidence that relics were housed in some of these churches, such as the early 6th century church at Ez-Zora, which conserves a dedicatory inscription to the revered relic of the holy martyr George. There is also a 6th century basilica at Jerash, Palestine, which contained a reliquary before the bishop's throne to house a relic of the saint. In Thessaloniki, the Galerian rotunda was rededicated in the name of George, perhaps in the 5th century, and may have housed a relic, just as the Martyrium in the same city housed relics of the other soldier saint, often depicted with George, Demetrius. The Empress Eudokia was the first to offer imperial patronage to the cult in the 5th century, when she established a chapel to the saint in a hospice at Sheikh Badr, west of Jerusalem. A century later, Justinian II built a church at Bazana, Armenia, for the martyr George, while he was fortifying the eastern frontier in that region. Justinian II donated a relic of the saint to Germanus of Paris, evidence that the cult had by this time spread into Merovingian Gaul. Justinian also built a church of George at Edessa and repaired the shrine at Lydda, perhaps to appease his Syrian subjects while he was attempting to bring about reunion of the Monophysite Church with Constantinople. In spite of the post-Chalcedonian divisions between Jacobite and Orthodox Christians in Syria, George remained popular with both communities. The shrine at Lydda was destroyed in the Muslim conquests in 1010. In the early 7th century, Heraclius had relics of George and his devotee Theodore of Sicyon translated to Constantinople, where they were placed in a new sanctuary near the Adrianople Gate. Early bronze crosses dating to the 6th century, now held in the Serafian collection in Beirut, show George as an orant, standing with his arms outstretched in prayer. Interestingly, he is not dressed as a soldier, but in courtly or priestly dress. He is shown without a beard and has a nimbus around his head. Some of these crosses were large enough to contain a relic fragment in their hollow centres, and thus functioned as portable reliquaries. They have been found in Syria and Asia Minor, and in most cases date from the 5th or 6th centuries. Another important piece of early visual evidence is a fresco of the bust of George found in the monastery of Apollo in Bawit, Egypt. This picture of George the Megalomartyr as a beardless youth in warrior garb with a happy expression and a nimbus around his head is centuries away from the medieval depictions of George the powerful dragon slayer. It seems probable that the early image was closer to the reality. The cult of George spread quite early from Eastern Christendom to the West, as evidenced by the many churches of St. George in the towns of Soissons and Metz, and the fortresses of Regensburg, Artsy and Manskastel from the late antique period onwards. It had spread to Merovingian Gaul by the 5th and 6th centuries, as dedications of churches in these regions indicate. In the late 5th century, the Merovingian king Clovis founded a cloister of St. George at Cambrai, and his wife Clotilde dedicated a convent to George in Chelles with relics in 491. This archaeological evidence is textually confirmed by 6th century author Gregory of Tours. In his work In Gloria Martyrum, he relates the transfer of the relics of George through the territory of Limoges. According to Gregory's account, the clerics who were carrying the relics came to an oratory in Limoges, where they were received hospitably by the brothers and spent the night there in prayer. When they were departing at daybreak, they found that they were unable to lift the reliquary. They realised then that God wished them to leave behind some of the relics of St. George, so they cut off a few pieces and presented them to the oratory. Gregory of Tours also alluded to relics of St. George in the village of Saint-Martin-des-Bois, in the territory of Le Mans, where they brought about miracles of healing for the blind, the lame, those with chills and other illnesses. The healing power of George's relics were requested by the saint in his final prayer at the point of death. The divine guarantee of the power of the relics and the name of the martyr are an important element of the cult, which was revalidated by each retelling of the story. In 565 to 600, Venantius Fortunatus commemorated Justinian's donation of relics to Germanus of Paris in his poem on the dedication of the Basilica of St. George, a church raised by Sidonius Apollinarius. By the end of the 7th century, as well as the churches in Gaul, there were churches of George in Rome, Ravenna and Sicily, where the cult was probably introduced by merchants and clerics from the Near East. One of our earliest Latin sources is the preface of St. Ambrose, preserved only in the Golden Legend of Jacob of Ragine, who, apart from adding the story of the dragon slaying, manages to conflate two earlier versions, in one of which George is tortured for his faith by Dacian, a Roman prefect, while in the other Dacian is a Persian king who is historically unattested. Ambrose recounts the latter version, in which George, the most loyal soldier of Christ, fools the Persian tyrant Dacian into taking him into the temple, on the pretext that he has repented and is prepared to make an offering to the pagan idols. Instead, in answer to his prayer, God destroyed the temple, its priests and all its idols. Dacian was infuriated by George's defiance against the pagan gods, especially when his queen Alexandria leapt to George's defence. Ambrose, as quoted in the Golden Legend, writes that the queen of the pagan Persians, although she had not yet been baptised, was shown mercy by God and received the palm of martyrdom when her cruel spouse condemned her to death. Hence we may not doubt that she, crimsoned with the dew of her blood, gained entrance through the celestial portal and merited the kingdom of heaven. Later, in the early 8th century, the Venerable Bede included George in his Martyrologium, noting that he was martyred under Dacian, king of the Persians, although the acts of his passion must be counted as apocryphal writings. Bede also mentions George briefly in his Martyrologicum Poeticum as the first saint whose feast is celebrated in April. And George, he said, sent forth from here, flew to the stars. The great importance of the cult in England after the time of Bede is well known and will be discussed by Dr. Richards later. In two Latin translations which were made independently of each other in the 5th century, the date of the feast is given as the 24th of April. Now, there is another saint whose feast falls on the 24th of April, Elizabeth the Wonder Worker, or Thaumaturgos, who is little known, especially in the West. The earlier version of her story, which probably dates to the 6th century, describes her activities as a helper of the poor and a healer of the sick, and her rigorous ascetic life of fasting without ever bathing and only changing her dress once a year. In passing, the author mentions that she killed a great and terrible serpent by prayer. The hymns which celebrate her life add a further detail. She handed it over to be eaten by wild beasts and birds. Unfortunately, they do not give a time or a place for these events, although the editors state that it is likely to have been a monastery in Constantinople. Her cult soon became popular in the Latin West and in Egypt. According to a later legend preserved in the Menologion, compiled under the rule of Basil II, St. Elizabeth was born to a Christian family in 5th century Heraclea. Since her parents died while she was still young, she gave away their wealth to the poor and entered the convent of St. George the Great in Constantinople. In time, she became abbess of the community and was given a new convent by the Emperor Leo I. But unfortunately, an enormous serpent, or a dragon, had already taken up residence in the building. Elizabeth, armed only with a crucifix, called the dragon out of the building, spat on it, and trampled it underfoot. The parallels between the stories of Elizabeth and George are strikingly obvious. The dedication of her convent on the Mikroslophos to George the Great indicates that this legend is dependent on the cult of St. George, but it may prefigure the medieval legend in the topos of the killing of the serpent. The earliest text we have of George slaying the dragon and rescuing the princess is found in a Georgian codex of the 11th century. The earliest surviving Greek account comes from the 12th. If we are to follow through the analogy of the Emperor King and the dragon, the true faith, as embodied by the early church, whose survival came under serious threat during imperial persecutions and later those of foreign rulers, is personified in the Virgin Princess of the medieval legend. By the 11th century, when church and state were virtually one, the church had little use for a legend in which the main villain was the Roman emperor, except perhaps in Georgia. However, the threat of a foreign king was still real. The East, from the 7th century onwards, faced continual invasions by Saracen forces, as well as by Avars, Slavs, and Bulgarians. Byzantium gradually lost control of the Greek islands, the Balkans, Asia Minor, and Georgia to the Muslim armies. From the 14th century onwards, the Ottomans gained most of what was left of the Byzantine Empire. Thus we find in Eastern icons images of George as the crusader, rescuing a boy from captivity to a foreign master, who is variously identified as a lord of the Bulgarians, the Agarenes, or the Saracens. This story began as a posthumous miracle, but eventually found its way into representations of events of his life, as if it were contemporary with his slaying of the dragon, as we saw in the first picture of the rood from Georgia. This boy is identified in one of the three versions of his story as the son of a widow from Mytilene on Lesbos. Perhaps, I suggest, we may see the medieval widow's son, who was saved from slavery to a foreign master, as an antitype of the earlier widow's son, who was held captive by blindness, deafness, and lack of mobility. The Western Church was by this time turning its attention to defending the Holy Land from the Saracens. Thus we can understand how, under the influence of the chivalric tradition, George was transformed from a noble military tribune into a knight on horseback, who was offered the hand of the princess after her safe delivery from the jaws of the dragon. The figure of the princess recalls her prototype, Queen Alexandra, who was tortured to death by her husband, the Persian king, for accepting Christianity through the example set by George. Thus, in the medieval legend, George again saves a woman of a royal house, but this time from a different enemy, and she, leading the captive or converted ruler by her girdle around its neck, shows to all that it has relinquished its power. In conclusion, the secret of George's success has lain in his ability to adapt to suit the exigencies of the time. In both Eastern and Western churches, he has remained an enduring symbol of the triumph of good over evil through the hand of God. From the patristic origins of the cult, based on imperial persecutions of the early church, to its eventual flourishing in the medieval miracles of the dragon slayer. The continuity of the cult of St. George bears witness to the strength of its Christian ideals.
Thank you, Bronwyn, for that very comprehensive exposition on the origins, patristic origins of the cult of St. George. We shall now break up for coffee, and we'll come back together at 11 o'clock. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Sam Riches, who is a teaching fellow in art history at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland. She has published a considerable number of papers on St. George, apart from her very important book. And she is now working on other saints who encountered monsters, amongst whom one finds St. Matthew and St. Philip. May I ask Sam Riches to take the podium and deliver her lecture? Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. I'd like to begin by expressing my grateful thanks to Father Joe for the invitation to come over. It's my first visit to Gozo, to Malta in general, and I've had an absolutely wonderful time for the last week, and I am now seeing St. George in a whole new way, and I think this will be informing some of my work in the future. In particular, I was very interested to see what happened in the Basilica on Monday evening, which was when the statue of St. George was removed from its niche and processed around the church. This incredibly lively, popular cult with enormous pride clearly being taken in the symbolism of St. George as the protector and patron of this island. And this seemed to be quite apart from the official church proceedings connected with the Feast of St. George. And so what we seem to have was a genuinely popular cult on the one hand and an official cult on the other. And for a medievalist, this was something which was really very, very interesting, because it seems to be very similar to the situation that we had in the 15th century, which is the period that I specialise in. It's certainly very different from what we find in contemporary England. If I had been in England for St. George's Day this week, I probably would have been interviewed by a local radio station, and that would have been it. There would have been very little visible sign in England that the patron's feast day was taking place. One or two pubs will lay on a special St. George's Day menu. You will maybe see a few more crosses of St. George flying, but that is about it. There are some moves at the moment to celebrate St. George's Day in a more formal way in England. For example, there is talk of holding a St. George's Day parade in London, which would be an equivalent to the St. Patrick's Day parade, which is already held in London, although St. Patrick is the patron saint of Ireland rather than England. But so far, it's very much a minority interest. However, there are elsewhere interests, signs of increase in interest in the idea of St. George as a symbol of the English nation. So, for example, at international sports events, whereas a few years ago you would see the Union flag, also known as the Union Jack, being flown, increasingly when it's the England team that are appearing, you will see the Cross of St. George. Particularly face paints. It's very popular for people to paint their faces because the Union flag is very difficult to do and the Cross of St. George is very easy. So I think this may be part of the reason. But certainly there are no commemorative stamps this year, as far as I'm aware, unlike Gozo. There are no feasts, there are no festivals. In honour of this particular anniversary of the date of his martyrdom, St. George is the patron of both England and Gozo, but the place he holds in the hearts and minds of English people and Gozitans is clearly very different. And I, for one, hope to see St. George take a greater place in English hearts and minds, which is much closer to what I have witnessed over the last few days here in Gozo. That said, most people in England are aware of St. George as part of the conception of their nationhood. He's perceived as a mythic hero fighting under the device of the Red Cross on a white field, a valiant Christian knight who rescued a beautiful princess from the predations of an evil dragon. His image and device are instantly recognisable, whether deployed as the English flag or on commercial insignia such as the signs of a particular brewer. On their pub signs they have St. George overcoming the dragon. But most English people know remarkably little about the man himself, or indeed how he came to be chosen as the patron of England. In part, this may be connected to a discernible sense of unease around the question of Englishness. What does it mean to be English today? Historically, being English has meant empire, the colonisation and subjugation of other peoples. And in consequence, I feel a significant proportion of English people today feel apologetic rather than proud of their heritage. The fact that St. George has been invoked as a symbol of empire, for example, in the iconography of war memorials, particularly from the Boer War and the First World War, has led to an ambivalence around his name and his image. If we cannot feel proud to be English, how can we be proud of St. George? However, recent developments within the United Kingdom, such as the establishment of the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, is leading to an increasing awareness of the need to reappraise what it means to be English, and to be English as distinct from British. Englishness need no longer be associated with colonisation, this idea of bringing civilisation to the uncivilised. But it can instead be concerned with some of the better aspects of that particularly English breed of civilisation, ideas perhaps of fair play and losing gracefully in international sport. In the pursuit of this redefinition of Englishness, it seems that St George may have a significant role to play. And here I would echo what Father Joe said to us this morning about the virtues that are associated with him: bravery, forbearance, endurance, looking after people who have difficulty looking after themselves. And these ideas can usefully be harnessed to make him a focal point for a new national consciousness. However, I do take slight issue with Father Joe when he said that outside Christian iconography, St George has little meaning. In fact, he is recognised as a holy figure both in Judaism and Islam. And this is particularly useful in the English context because England is increasingly a multicultural country. And so to have a patron who can draw in people from different faiths, not simply Christianity, is potentially very important. And so during this symposium, we are primarily concerned with St George as a figure of Christian witness, but it's important that we do not overlook his role in other faiths too. Indeed, the fact that the figure of St George, particularly as a symbol of fertility, is almost certainly a Christianisation of a pre-Christian deity, is testimony to his power to reach across religious divides. I feel there is also much to learn from medieval English understandings of this saint. It is difficult to be sure when he came to be recognised as the English patron, but arguably it's during the 14th and 15th centuries. Quite why is also uncertain. I do apologise for the state of my throat today. So it's uncertain why he is chosen as the patron saint of England. This is a strong contrast with the situation in other parts of the British Isles. There are clear reasons why the particular patron saints of Scotland, Wales and Ireland were selected. Each of them has some physical link with the countries that they represent. But St George's links with England are decidedly tenuous. Some English towns claim to be the place of his birth or the site of his combat with the dragon, but any investigation into the development of his cult demonstrates that these traditions are of no great antiquity. Indeed, as Bronwyn has told us, the story of the dragon slaying is a late addition to the narrative of this saint, and we can be certain that he was venerated in England well before there was any mention of the dragon. So, for example, we find that he appears in a 9th century Anglo-Saxon ritual at Durham, also a Saxon martyrology from around the 10th century. And Aelfric's Passion of St George, which is the earliest version of the life of St George written in Old English, this was composed at York between 1020 and 1051. Notably, it makes no mention of the dragon. And indeed, St George is not defined even as a soldier in this text. He is described merely as a holy man. And I think this is similar perhaps to the presentation that we saw in the Byzantine cross that Bronwyn was showing us. This idea of St George as a soldier is one variation, which ultimately perhaps becomes the most important variation. We also have some evidence of foundations in England before the Norman conquest of 1066. For example, a church at Fordington in Dorset is mentioned in King Alfred's will, and it was clearly dedicated in St George's honour. And also King Canute, who reigned from 1016 to 35, or perhaps his own father Sweyn, seems to have founded a house of regular canons at Thetford under St George's patronage. There was also a church in Southwark, which is now part of London, dedicated to St George in Anglo-Saxon times, and we have another church at Doncaster in Yorkshire in 1061. But it is not until the reign of King Edward III, whose dates are 1327 to 77, that any move is made to identify St George as the patron saint of England. At this time, there are no stories about St George visiting England, such as the tale that he was a great friend of the Emperor Constantine and his mother St Helen, the discoverer of the true cross, and that he was present in York at the time of Constantine's acclamation as emperor. This story, along with narratives of the dragon slaying, identifying St George as a native of Coventry or Cornwall, arise much later, particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries. In other words, attempts to link St George to England in any concrete way, to explain his role as patron saint of the country, are all post-Reformation. St George's cult was one of the very few Catholic devotions which was allowed to persist into the peculiarly English brand of Protestantism which came to form the Anglican Church. The reasons for this seem to be related to St George's role as a political symbol, as we shall see, and we can perhaps detect an attempt to retrospectively rationalise his selection as patron saint of the country by identifying him as a definitively English saint, a status which he has no claim to whatsoever. In 1351, it was written that the English nation call upon St George as being their special patron, especially in war. This is the first recorded reference to an understanding of St George as a patron of England, although it is by no means clear what the reference actually means. It follows hard on the heels of the foundation of the Order of the Garter, England's premier chivalric institution, and St George's Chapel at Windsor Castle by Edward III. This is the place where the Order of the Garter is located. It's the focus of its devotion. But it's notable that when the Order of the Garter was founded, it actually enjoyed the joint patronage of the Holy Trinity, the Virgin Mary, and St Edward the Confessor, as well as St George, although these other dedicatees were quickly relegated to a very minor role. This development corresponds to St George's gradual displacement of St Edward the Confessor as the English patron saint, or an English patron saint, I should say. Edward the Confessor was King of England between 1042 and 66. It's by no means clear whether he was ever recognised as the patron of the entire nation of England during the medieval period, and certainly I would argue that the same can be said of St George. There is strong evidence that suggests that both saints, Edward the Confessor and George, were called upon by discrete groupings within English society, rather than by the populace as a whole, and that they served quite specific functions within their roles as the ostensible national patrons. The English monarchy is the most obvious social grouping that honoured St George as the patron of England. We could certainly interpret the term nation in the 1351 reference to the English nation calling upon St George as nothing more than a reference to the personification of the nation in the person of the king. Indeed, I'd like to stress the likelihood that ordinary late medieval English people felt little or no connection to St George, and they may well have not honoured him any more highly than the general pantheon of saints. The evidence we have, patchy though it undoubtedly is, suggests that family tradition and localised cults were of primary importance within everyday understandings of the role of saints. People would turn to their name saint, or the saint associated with their community when in need. Where I come from, in North Buckinghamshire, which is about 100 miles north of London, we have two local saints. There is St Rumbold, who was a miraculous talking baby, And we also have Sir John Sean, a priest who owes his popular acclamation as a saint to the rather remarkable efforts he made to trap the devil in a boot. He also discovered a holy well, and this underlines the significance of location in the development of a cult. So, as many of you may know, people fearing lightning strikes would appeal to St. Barbara. Miners would turn St. Anne. Who your national patron is, I think, really has very little importance at this time. Another significant aspect is that the presence of a tomb or relics would have a powerful influence on the formation of a cult. Earlier this week, I was privileged to see the arm bone of St. Ursula in the cathedral here in Gozo. She's an English princess who was martyred in Germany, and yet she is venerated here in Gozo, and I think one of the major reasons will be because of the presence of this relic. We should note that this type of physical manifestation of a saint was removed from Great Britain during the Reformation, but it would have been of enormous importance during the pre-Reformation period. The fact that there is no shrine of St. George in England, or even an identifiable locus for the cult before the end of the 14th century, must be added into our understanding of the role that he played in English culture. The foundation of St. George's Chapel at Windsor by Edward III provided the physical focus for a cult from the late 14th century onwards, especially as it contained relics such as the heart of St. George, which was presented by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund on his induction into the Order of the Garter. But we should note that St. George did not have the stage to himself at Windsor. Honours were shared with Edward the Confessor to some extent, and also with my own favourite, Sir John Sean, the saint from my own locality. His relics were translated to Windsor amidst much pomp and ceremonial during the 15th century, and went on to form a centre of pilgrimage. So really, Windsor was a place that cults were moved to, so that the money that was accruing from pilgrimage could go more directly to the king. Rather a jaundiced view perhaps, but I think it's probably true. So, an individual in 15th century England may have had a devotion to St. George, but I feel that this was due to be more likely to be due to his or her profession, such as being a knight, their locale, such as living near Windsor, or perhaps a cure or other favour obtained following a pilgrimage to Windsor. Family tradition should not be ruled out either, though we should note that it was not until the time of the Hanoverian kings, this sequence of King Georges, that the personal or Christian name George became established in English usage. So we seem to have a case of imposition of national veneration rather than a genuinely popular cult. This veneration was imposed from the top. English kings have a long tradition of interest in St. George, although the date at which this dynastic veneration was established is in some dispute. Richard Coeur de Lion, who reigned 1189 to 99, is sometimes credited with establishing the English cult of St. George, but as we have seen, there are clear signs that the saint was venerated in England long before the Crusades. Richard himself may have had a personal interest in this saint, but his great-nephew, Edward I, who reigned 1272 to 1307, may well have had a stronger claim to be recognised as the king responsible for adding St. George to the canon of English saints, for he instigated the practice of displaying St. George's banner alongside those of the native saints, St. Edmund, who was another king, and Edward the Confessor. It's likely that the usurpation of Edward the Confessor's role as the English patron saint relates to the identification of St. George as a figure of chivalry and authority, especially prowess in battle. For St. Edward the Confessor was a decidedly non-martial king, and St. George's identification as a military leader is quite likely to be based upon the miraculous appearances that he is said to have made at various battles, especially where he led the Crusaders to victories at Jerusalem and Antioch in 1098, just as he appeared in these islands somewhat later. This mythic ability to appear and lead an army to an improbable victory gave St. George a clear advantage over these native English patrons, Edward the Confessor and Edmund, for neither of them were associated with victory in battle. Indeed, St. Edmund, who was a 9th century king of the East Angles, was said to have been killed during a defeat by the Danes in 869. Yet St. George did not displace his rivals outright, but was identified as one of a group of patrons of England for a number of years. Thus we find that in 1377, Richard II was crowned with Edward the Confessor's crown, whilst wearing the Confessor's coat, and the slippers of St. Edmund. He maintained his veneration of these two saints throughout his life, even though royal devotion to St. George was clearly established during the reign of his grandfather Edward III. The supreme indication of Edward III's veneration of St. George was, of course, the founding of the Order of the Garter, but he also had a strong personal interest in the saint throughout his reign. His own devotion was almost certainly a significant factor in the development of a wider cult. Edward owned a relic of the saint's blood, which was included in an inventory of royal relics made in 1331-2, and wall paintings on the east wall of St. Stephen's Chapel at Westminster from the mid-14th century and destroyed around the year 1800 are known to have featured the king, his wife Philippa of Hainault, and their 10 children alongside St. George as their patron saint. However, when we turn to the Wilton diptych, which we have here, this is a personal portable altarpiece, almost certainly made for Edward's successor and grandson Richard II. We see Richard kneeling with his patron saints, Edmund, who is here with his arrow. This is Edward the Confessor with the ring, and this is John the Baptist. And they are together paying homage to the Virgin and Child here. Sorry, I'm coming away from the... Right. So, the question is, where in this image is St. George? Edmund and Edward, as I've said to you, are both English kings as well as saints, and we have seen that they are regularly invoked in royal imagery. John the Baptist, meanwhile, was Richard's personal saint, for his birthday fell on the feast of the baptism of Christ. It could be that George was not included in this image because he had no direct link with Richard. He was, of course, not a king of England. And the date of St. George's feast does not seem to coincide with any important date in Richard's own life. However, it is at least possible that the banner here, which is being passed between Richard and the angels and being blessed by the Christ child, was understood as the emblem of St. George as well as England. It's difficult to know when the red cross on a white field was accepted, either as the symbol of St. George or indeed of England, rather than simply the banner of the resurrection, which this undoubtedly stood for in earlier times and indeed continued to stand for throughout the medieval period. I apologise, I don't have a detailed slide to show you, but the orb here is particularly important in this reading of the banner standing for both England and St. George. It was during cleaning of this altarpiece undertaken in the late 1980s, it was discovered that the orb there, which is about the size of the end of my finger, actually is a little picture, and it contains an image of an island set in a silver sea, which is a nice Shakespearean allusion. And it seems to be that what we have is an image of England that is being passed on the banner between Richard and the angels for the blessing of the Christ child. This is invoking the idea of St. George as Our Lady's Knight. This is a motif that is very common in the late medieval cult of St. George, especially in England. There is clear evidence to suggest that during the late Middle Ages, England was considered, by English people at least, to be the Virgin's dowry, a realm over which the Virgin Mary had special authority, and St. George was identified as her champion. So when we see here the flag, possibly of St. George, with this idea of England in association with the Virgin Mary. The identification of George as the champion of the Virgin Mary seems to be underlying that idea in the minds of English people looking at this image at this date. Around a century after this image was made, which is around 1400, a bit less than a century, Edward IV began to rebuild St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, possibly in thanks for the saint's aid in the recovery of his crown after the temporary re-establishment of Henry VI. This is during the Wars of the Roses. He spent over £1,000 a year on the rebuilding of St. George's Chapel, which is an absolutely enormous sum of money. Part of this rebuilding included the erection of new choir stalls with decorative bench ends. Have the next slide, please. And some of these bench ends feature scenes of the legend of St. George himself. Here we have one of these images from Windsor. It is St. George kneeling before the Virgin Mary. Here's St. George, the Virgin Mary and the Christ child. The Virgin is seated with the infant Christ, and there is a bunch of lilies behind her, which I know is difficult to see in this slide. St. George is kneeling before them in the centre of the composition, and we also have his horse here, and there are some angels behind holding a banner. This again is the idea of St. George as Our Lady's Knight. And it's possible that this image may carry the connotation of England herself, showing reverence to her true heavenly ruler. The narrative of St. George as Our Lady's Knight has not survived in written form, but it is recorded in several visual cycles of the life of the saint, notably in stained glass at Stamford in Lincolnshire. Next, please. In the early years of the 15th century, the church of St. George at Stamford was virtually derelict, but from around 1420 it was restored at huge expense by William Bruges. We're here looking at the chancel of the church, of St. George's Church at Stamford in Lincolnshire, to give you a sense of where these windows were. They were round these three walls here. Bruges himself was a native of Wiltshire, and his reasons for deciding to patronise this particular building are obscure. It's several hundred miles away from his own locality. But it's likely that the dedication to St. George was a determining factor. 1415, William Bruges became the first Garter King of Arms. This was a very important heraldic post. In effect, the holder was the chief herald of all England. Bruges' position in the Order of the Garter is reflected in his decision to include a series of images of the men he thought to have been the founder knights of the order. Next, please. And their patron saints in the glazing of the chancel. So this is, again, the three walls. These are the founder knights of the Order of the Garter along the bottom, with an image of St. George in the middle. There. And along the top, we have images of the life of St. George right the way across. It is likely that Bruges' own interest in St. George went well beyond the saint's connection with chivalry. As we can see, the images of the founder knights are accompanied by a series of subjects of the life of St. George. Sadly, virtually all of the chancel glass was destroyed during the iconoclasm of the 17th century, but copies of the images made shortly prior to the English Civil War record 21 of the subjects. And what's significant is that although Bruges is a herald and is deeply connected with the Order of the Garter, it is not the chivalric aspect of St. George that seems to be stressed in the images of St. George that he uses. Next, please. One very interesting aspect of the Stamford imagery is the evidence it provides of the English legend of St. George as Our Lady's Knight. What we have here is St. George in battle against an unidentified enemy host. Next, please. He's very unfortunate. He's taken prisoner, and he is then beheaded. Now, as you can see, he is kneeling before an altar which has an image of the Virgin and Child on it. It is, and the man here wielding an axe is clearly not a Christian. No Christian would pollute an altar in this way. But the purpose there is to demonstrate this isn't his devotion to the Virgin. Next image, please. Now we see him being resurrected by the Virgin. So here's St. George in his tomb, and the Virgin is resurrecting him because of his devotion to her. There are 3 other extant surviving late 15th century cycles, all the products of English artists and craft workers, which include this story. And in each case, the next episode shows St. George being armed as a knight by the Virgin. Sadly, this image is missing from the record of Stamford, but the next part of the story is found in each of the 4 versions. Next, please. For St. George is then shown fighting the dragon. This suggests that the saint was understood to have been resurrected in order that he should kill the dragon. This account is, of course, entirely different from the imagery found in European narratives of St. George, whether literary or visual. Interestingly, it does not appear in any extant English hagiography of the saint, and it may indicate an embellishment of the identification of St. George as Our Lady's Knight, which existed only as an oral and visual tradition. Could I have the next image, please? And then it goes, as we can see here, this is St. George baptising the king and the queen and the rescued princess and the townspeople in exchange for him killing the dragon. So the dragon story is absolutely normal in this version. Now, we should note that the link between the Virgin Mary and St. George is recognised elsewhere in Europe. Next, please. This is an alabaster statuette. It's unclear where it's from. It's currently in Poland, but it's certainly not English. And we have the Virgin and Child. There is the crucified Christ here with the dead serpent draped around the cross. And underneath we have St. George killing the dragon and rescuing the princess. So a very strong link being made between the Virgin, who is the largest figure in the top image, and what's going on here. And also the idea of St. George as a figure of Christ overcoming the serpent, overcoming the devil. The dragon is often understood to be a form of the devil. Next, please. Also on the Valencia altarpiece, which is in London, but was made by a German artist for a Spanish community at Valencia, we have here the Virgin Mary arming St. George as a knight. Now, this is quite separate from the story of resurrection and so forth. That doesn't appear anywhere in this story. Next one, please. But we do, though, have some evidence in this image of a localisation of tradition. This is one of the central panels at Valencia, and here we have St. George appearing in battle. This is a specific battle that took place in 1237, and he is coming to the aid of the Spanish against the Moors. So, clear evidence of a localisation of a story of St. George, just as we are getting the idea of St. George being linked very strongly with the Virgin Mary, seeming to be localised in this particular story in England. Now, it is clear that St. George was intimately associated with English kings during the late medieval period. But clearly, the monarchy did not command an exclusive claim to the saint. Whilst evidence of the devotion of lesser people is much harder to interpret conclusively as a result of the losses of altars, images, and other tangible aspects of the cult, in addition to the simple lack of recording of many types of veneration, there are still strong indications that St. George was a popular saint in many parts of England, just as elsewhere in Europe. Almost 100 English wall paintings featuring the saint are known, dating largely from the late 14th and 15th centuries. They invariably depict St. George in combat with the dragon. Late medieval English images in glass, wood, or other materials are less common, almost certainly as a result of iconoclasm. But it is notable that St. George is recorded as a painted decorative figure on 7 church screens in the county of Norfolk alone. There is little direct evidence about the motives for such commissions. The venerators who express their devotion to a particular saint by paying for the creation of wall paintings and other images within churches are almost always anonymous and have left us few clues about their wealth, status, or personal concerns. These works could have been created as the expression of a general interest in St. George in these communities, but it may well be that relatively wealthy devotees were imposing their reverence for the saint on their poorer neighbours because they were the only people rich enough to be able to afford to pay for the beautification of the church. One good example of such moneyed patronage in honour of St. George is found in the records of the ridings of St. George. Throughout much of the 14th and 15th centuries, local organisations of people devoted to St. George, usually known as Guilds of St. George, held a procession on the saint's feast day. These festivities are known to have taken place in many English towns, and there are several aspects of these guilds and their ridings which are particularly striking. Next, please. Now, this is not a medieval image, you'll probably notice that, it's a photograph, but it is of a Guild of St. George in 1890 from a village called Cossey in Norfolk. And we have them here dressed up for their riding, and here is the dragon. And people are dressed up to play different parts in the story of St. George. Next, please. We also have this, which is the civic snap. Again, from Norfolk, it's in the Castle Museum in Norwich. And here we can see how the dragon was actually impersonated. This skirt arrangement here hides the legs of the person carrying. It's like a very large puppet. It's about 15 feet long, nose to tail. And as the name implies, the jaws snap like this. So this is carried in procession. Again, this is not a medieval image. This is Victorian, but it's likely that the head has been reused and may well be a genuine 15th century head, and it's clearly from a processional dragon of exactly this type. The guilds of St. George, who carried out these ridings, were often very closely allied with civic authority. In late medieval Norwich, where this is from, for example, the Guild of St. George functioned in effect as a branch of local government. Membership of St. George guilds was often tightly controlled, with only the upper echelons of society admitted, and there is some evidence to suggest that the ridings could also be used as a means of social control, for St. George was strongly identified as a figure of urban authority. Next, please. Briefly going back to Windsor here, but something we should note is that the battle with the dragon invariably takes place outside a city wall. That is the city wall that is indicated here. The princess is leading the dragon back to the city in order for it to be executed. And what we have is St. George rescuing a city, urban civilization, from the predations of a dragon, which represents chaos and disorder. A good example of this trend towards an iconography of social control occurs at Leicester, where the urban patriciate class ensured the reimposition of the social status quo by demanding that the humbler neighbours should all view the mounted and expensively costumed procession of the riding. A local bylaw of 1467 stipulated that the entire citizenry of the town had to turn out and witness the parade under pain of fines for non-attendance. Next, please. This is a contemporary image from Leicester. It's 1510, nice piece of stained glass. And here we have an image which was commissioned by a known urban patrician, a man called John Wigston, who was sometime mayor of Leicester, and he clearly invokes St. George as a figure of urban control. So we have St. George identified as a figure of authority. He's a conquering hero, overcoming a physical threat to order. And this was almost certainly at the root of his appeal to English kings too. However, England is far from being the only country to invoke St. George as her patron. One commentator on the cult of St. George noted that he has been claimed as patron saint of Germany, Portugal, Barcelona, Genoa, Ferrara, Armenia, Antioch, Constantinople, various parts of France, and of the Coptic Christians, whilst St. George for Holy Russia was the battle cry of the Tsars. Other writers have added Aragon, Hungary, Lithuania, Hanover, Schleswig, Braganza, Valencia, and Malta, or perhaps Gozo, to this list of countries and provinces that have placed themselves under St. George's patronage. This formidable list underlines the wide geographic spread of St George's cult, as well as the extent of the veneration that he has enjoyed. Next, please. Just briefly, this is a German image here. This is by Holbein. Next, please. This is a Swedish one by Bernt Nocter, and this is commemorating a victory of the Swedes over the Danes in battle. And again, St George was thought to have appeared on the battlefield. It's the date of this sculpture is 1489. Part of this appeal to these many and varied places must lie in the very nature of his combat with the dragon, for this has formed a very useful visual shorthand for the battle between good and evil. I've got some examples here of the dragon being invoked as a symbol of heresy, for example. Next, please. This is exactly what Father Joe was talking about earlier on, where we have the dragon being vilified here. It is a form of the Catholic Church. It has many heads, one of which has a papal tiara. And here, this image is invoking the figure of Christ, the infant Christ in the form of St George. And the true church in the background is being rescued. This is clearly a Protestant image by Peter Gotland of 1552. One of the significant things about this image is that it has a breast. There is a breast on the dragon. It's making it female. Next, please. And it's been taken from just this kind of image. This is the papal ass of 1523. Very complex iconographically, this image, but the significant point is that it was used by Protestant reformers such as Philip Melanchthon as a version of the evils of the Church of Rome. But for our purposes, the significant point is that it is gendered female. It seems that if you want to make something even worse than it already is, you make it female in this very, very clearly sexualized way. Next, please. So, for example, here is a version by Dürer of George and the Dragon here is gendered female with genitalia. Next, please. Here is one by Albrecht Altdorfer, again a German image, 1511, and the dragon is gendered female with breasts. I won't show you lots of images of dragons with genitals, you'll be pleased to know, but that is much more common than the use of the breast on a dragon. This is very rare. Next, please. This English sculpture from Coventry, 15th century, is also gendered female. You can't really see it here. But the significant thing is it was used on a gate chapel. So it is again the town subduing the wilderness outside. St George is the figure of authority, and he's arguably also a figure of chastity. It's something I don't really have time to go into. But he is in stark opposition to the dragon, this sexualized, feminized, evil figure of chaos that he's always overcoming. And a gate chapel, which is the threshold between the town and the countryside, is the perfect place for this kind of image. Next, please. Why the dragon gets to be seen in this way, I think, is related to images of the fall. This is a 15th century French manuscript. You may be aware that the snake, is often given a female face. This is a variation which is actually more dragon-like because it has wings as well as the snaky tail. It's partly the wings may be a reference to it being a fallen angel, but it's more likely that this is supposed to make you think of a dragon because those are very unangelic wings. Next, please. This is again from Norwich. This is a wall painting. I'm sorry, wall paintings always come up very badly on slides. But here the dragon is female and has babies. There are baby dragons lurking there. And again we have the invocation of the town that St George is defending and protecting against this evil female creature outside. Now, I'm running out of time rapidly here, but I'll move on to the next one. Alongside all this idea of St George as a dragon slayer and a symbol of authority, we have nevertheless interest in St George as a martyr. This image is created for John Duke of Bedford, who is the brother of Henry V. Here, this is probably this is John Duke of Bedford here, and this is probably an image of his dead brother Henry V in the guise of St George, handing over the regency to his brother. But notice what we have is no reference at all to dragon slaying. We have St George as a martyr. Next, please. This image is from approximately the same date. It's made for the same patron. Yes, we have the dragon story in lots of wonderful detail there, but what we also have is a whole run of images of St. George as a martyr in this very same manuscript. So it is possible, even when a lot of emphasis is given to the dragon, to have St. George as a martyr operating alongside. The motif of gruesomely tortured flesh, which was common to the presentation of many saints in both written and visual treatments of their lives, is related to the concept of the saint as a type of Christ, an exemplar of Christian forbearance, and in some cases the tortures are clearly modelled on the passion of Christ himself. Next, please. So here at Stamford we have the flagellation of St. George. Notice that he has a cross that he is attached to there. Next, please. We have here a German image of the flagellation of Christ. It is clearly this, I'm not saying this specific image was used as a model, but it's the same ideas that are being invoked in the image of St. George as the tortured martyr. And this is where the main emphasis of Stamford is, not on the chivalry, but on St. George as a martyr. So we have a few here, we'll go through them quickly. St. George on the rack. Next, please. St. George probably being burnt. This is one of the drawings that wasn't finished. Next, please. St. George being boiled. Next, please. St. George being sawn in half. This is a blade that he's seated on, and these are millstones that are pulling him down. Also, the blade is being lifted, probably. Next, please. This is St. George being poisoned. One of the things we should note about the torture of St. George is that all of them are borrowed from other saints. In the medieval period, he is what I term a pick and mix saint. You can give him whatever torture you like. This particular torture, of course, is associated with John the Evangelist. Next, please. Here we have St. George being sawn in half again, the other way round. Next, please. St. George on the wheel, just like St. Catherine. Next, please. St. George being beaten. Next, please. And of course then he's beheaded finally. Next, please. Now, going back to Windsor, we've got again an emphasis on torture, but it is less marked here. There are relatively few images of torture. Here's St. George. I'm particularly fond of this one. St. George has been cut up and his body parts are being boiled. This is a variation on him being boiled whole. Next, please. And here he is being dragged through the streets on a hurdle. I'm unclear what the figure falling backwards off the horse is. If anybody has any ideas, please tell me, because I've never seen anything else like it. And finally, this is the very last image at Stamford, which is the relics of St. George being venerated. And what we have here is a symbol, perhaps, of veneration of St. George in England being genuine devotion. It isn't, although I have argued that it is an imposed devotion, he isn't really the national patron saint until much later. He is not simply a saint of the monarchy. I think during the 15th century we are seeing a lively cult of St. George. It's being used to particular ends. It's being used in ways related to propaganda and social control, most specifically. But nevertheless, despite all this, there was a genuine cult of St. George, and to go back to my opening remarks, something that I hope can be reinvigorated in contemporary English society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sam Riches, for your extremely interesting lecture.